this lesson is very similar to the last lesson about absolute values. But all we're doing is that we're seeing what happens to the graph or the function when we square root it or we use y squared here, okay? And so we'll be using a table of values or otherwise to find the square roots of f of x and other variations, so that will be the y squared. So let's get straight to it. If you watched the last video, you would have seen how we got these table of values, but really that's going back to year 8, okay? So we just substituted in for f of x and we get we substitute our x values into f of x and we get our values out. Now, what does square root do? Well, simply, all we have to do is square root the numbers of f of x. So this will be the square root of 15. And if I put in my calculator, I'm going to get about roughly 3.9. And if I do the square root of 8, so I'm doing these right now, you get roughly 2.8. So roughly 2.8. Square root of 3, you get roughly 1.7. Square root of 0 is just 0. Square root of negative 1, how do we do that? Well, you can't do, so can't do. Square root of 0 is 0. Square root of 3 is the same as this one, so it's roughly 1.7, okay? So what happens, it actually changes it quite a bit. And as we square root like really, really little numbers, it changes it even more. Now look at this. This is our original graph, which we've had for absolute values and square roots. And now look what happens with the square root of f of x. Now, what I've got here doesn't go as far as minus 3, so let's go minus 2. We said it's about 2.8, and which is almost 3, and you can see that it is there. And then this one's 1.7 at minus 1, so which is, yeah, getting close to 2, and there it is there. So you can see how it changes, okay? All right, so copy that down, and just, like, if you're struggling with this, just do a table of values, square root it, do rough numbers like I have, and then plot your graph, okay? One thing to note is that in the negative part, so here, we can't square root negative numbers in the real domain, so it doesn't exist here, okay? Just like we can't produce negative values with absolute values, and so the graph doesn't exist there. All right, so now what we're going to do is that we're going to look at a very similar graph, except it's minus f of x, okay? Now, all it is, it's the same one, because you know how if we square root, we get plus or minus? Well, the minus one's the same. I'm not going to fill it in. But it's the negative one, okay? It's the negative one. It goes down. So all these values that we have here in the previous one, so square root of 8, square root of 3, square root of 3 here, it will be the negative one. Because you know when we square root, we get plus or minus. So we get these graphs going down the bottom. So you can do that as well. One last graph, okay? And it's the graph of y squared. Now, what the graph of y squared is, it's the combination of both the square root of the positive and negative square roots of your graph of f of x. Now, the reason why is that this axis is the y-axis. It's not the y squared axis, all right? So we need to bring it down to y, so to be able to graph y squared. So that means that we need to do plus or minus the square root of 15, plus or minus the square root of 8, and plus or minus the square root of 3. And obviously the square root of 0 is just 0. Now, can we square root negative 1? We can't. Can't square root numbers in the real realm. Okay? So we can't square root numbers. This will be 0, and this will be plus or minus square root of 3. So what happens is that we actually get the positive one and we actually get the negative one as well. So if we look at here, we get the combination of the last two graphs that we've seen. Now, if I can summarize what we're doing here, is just build a table of values, pick some important points, and then draw it, okay? Now, be aware that with when we're square rooting, there is no graph that exists where the original one is negative. Anyway, that's that lesson. Peace out.